Hey everyone, welcome to our next lecture. Today we're going to be talking about summary and narration. So let's go ahead and get into it. So summary, first and foremost, let's go ahead and talk about what that means. If you've heard this before, hopefully this will be a good refresher for you. If this is all new information, great. Go ahead and get out whatever you need to take notes and let's jump in. All right, so what is a summary? A summary is a brief statement or account of the main points of something. This is when, let's say you are reading an article online and somebody asks you, hey, what's that about? Instead of you reading them the entire article, this is you just kind of giving them a brief overview of the main points of what the article talked about. It's you stating what the author of that piece said in your own words. Summary is important for many reasons. First, it condenses information into a digestible format. So like I said, if someone asked you, hey, I know that you just read The Great Gatsby. What's that about? You wouldn't say, hold on, really quick, pull out the entire book and read it to them. You would give it to them in a more digestible format. Condense the entire book, pull out the main points, the big main things that happen in the story, and then you would tell the person that. So condensing the information into a digestible format. It also enhances understanding and retention. This is for us as the reader, right? So when we read something, if we are able to summarize it for ourselves, that helps us understand what it said and retain that information, right? When we put things into our own words, it's easier to remember. That's why when we take notes, or at least when I was taught how to take notes when I was in middle school, one of the points that the teacher said was that after you take notes during a lecture, go back at the very end, read the notes, and then write like a little paragraph, write a little summary of whatever it is you talked about or you learned during that lecture. That way you understand it more and you're able to retain the information better. And honestly, that's been really successful for me. So if you've never tried that, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. But regardless, writing a summary enhances understanding and retention. It also provides a quick insight into the original material. Again, rather than having somebody read an entire book or novel or short story or whatever it is, right? Summarizing something just gives somebody a very quick insight into what the actual original text had said. So these are the key elements of a summary. We have the main idea, supporting details, and brevity. So first, main ideas. When we give a summary, we want to make sure that we capture the essence of the overall source. Like, what is the big message that this piece of reading is trying to argue or persuade the reader to do, think, feel, whatever it may be, right? So each source or each material piece that you read, there really is a main idea, right? And so in order for us to give a good summary, we need to make sure that the summary we give or the details that we include, they lead or add up to what the overall main idea is, right? Because when we give a summary, we want whoever is reading our summary to understand what the main idea of the source is. So that's super important, capturing the essence of the source material. That leads us to supporting details. So how do we give off or convey this main idea, right? We give supporting details, right? We want to include only the most important points. When we read a reading material or a text, whatever it is, there's a lot of information in that text. There always is. How do we know what to pull out, to include in our summary, to avoid including all of these kind of unimportant, minute details? We have to just think to ourselves, which of these points are the most important that convey this main idea? What are the big points that this author is using to convey the main idea, right? So that's kind of one of the first things that you have to do with a summary is, of course, you have to know the main idea, but before you create your summary, you have to know what are the main points that I am going to include that support this main idea. Third, we have brevity. It's super important to keep this concise without losing meaning. Though one of the big parts of summary is you're giving a shortened version of a different text in your own words. So it should be short, it should be concise. We talked about writing concisely in one of our last lectures, so hopefully that's still fresh in your mind. So you want to be picky with what details you include because you want it to be very short, okay, without losing meaning. When I say without losing meaning, sometimes what happens is students think, okay, for a summary, I have to keep it really short. And so they exclude some of the main points that convey the main idea of the piece. And when we leave those out, our summary may not be 100% correct or may not reflect the actual main idea of the source you're summarizing. So yes, it's important to keep it brief. Writing it concisely is super important, but we also want to make sure that we don't lose any meaning. We want to make sure that all of the important parts that should be in there are in there. So here are the steps to creating a summary. So first, you of course have to read the material, right? Read the original material thoroughly, right? It's very important for you to actually understand the text, right? You can't summarize something that you don't understand. So the very first step is to read the original material and read it thoroughly, okay? Next, you're going to break the text into sections or paragraphs to simplify the process. So if you're reading a book, maybe look at this in chapters. So what is the main point of this chapter? What's the main point of this chapter, right? Breaking the reading up into sections so you can really dig and identify the key main points, which is our next bullet point. Identifying the main points that are central to the author's message and meaning of the text. It's going to be harder for you to do that when you're just looking at the text as a whole, but rather if you break the text into smaller sections, it'll be easier for you to pull the key ideas or the main points. Lastly, of course, you are using your own words to articulate the points that you've identified, right? It's also super important to maintain the same logical order as the original text. So if you are reading a speech and the first part of the speech is about activism, the second part of the speech is about oppression, and the third part of the speech is about resilience, you would want to follow that order in your summary. You wouldn't start by talking about resilience and then go to oppression and then go to activism. That would be backwards, right? So when you're giving a summary and you are summarizing these main points to articulate what the main idea of this piece is, it's important for you to follow the same order that the original text laid out. Here are some do's and don'ts of summarizing. So you do want to be concise and clear. Keep it short, but make sure you're including all of the important details, okay? Maintain the original material's meaning. This is pretty obvious, right? When you're summarizing, you are just putting what somebody else said into your own words, but you shouldn't be giving like your own opinions and your own ideas. This is literally just you putting what somebody else said into your own words. So it's important for you to maintain the original meaning of the original source, okay? Using direct quotations to support main points. So in a summary, you will use direct quotations. We're going to talk a little bit about this in an upcoming lecture, so don't worry too much about this now. But just know when you summarize, you will be incorporating a few direct quotations, and we'll talk about that in a little while in a future lecture. But for now, you should know that. The don'ts of summarizing. You should not omit essential information, right? Yes, we want to be concise, but we also want to make sure we're including all of the important points that are needed to convey the source's main idea, right? We do not want to include unnecessary details, right? It's important for you to figure out what those key points are and only include those key points in your summary, right? We don't need to include every single little detail of the article. That's not what a summary is, right? So including unnecessary details is something that you want to avoid. Lastly, you should not include your own opinions or interpretations. Again, a summary is you restating what a source said in your own words. Your opinion of what the source says it has nowhere to belong in a summary, right? It's not the time or place for it. Your own opinion and your interpretation of a text is obviously extremely important, but it shouldn't be included in a summary. So please know that. So the don'ts: you shouldn't omit essential information, you shouldn't include unnecessary details, and you definitely should not include your own opinions or interpretations. So citing the original author, of course, when we are summarizing, we are using our own words. However, what we're talking about are not your ideas, right? You're summarizing the ideas of somebody else. So it's very important to include in-text citations when introducing main ideas, okay? So here's an example. This is from Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness. So Brown reflects on the experience of trying out for her school's drill team, emphasizing the event as the catalyst for the decades-long feelings of loneliness and isolation. So that's me summarizing an important part in Brene Brown's book. Yes? See the 9 in parentheses? That is called an in-text citations. We will talk about this in an upcoming lecture, but I do want you to know this now, that when we're summarizing, even though it's our words, it's still not our ideas. So it's very important that we're using in-text citations to credit the original author. This is a way to avoid plagiarism, right? When we are discussing ideas that are not our own, again, even when we're using our own words, we still need to give the credit where the credit is due, right? So the 9 in parentheses, that is me telling the reader that in Brene Brown's book, all of this information can be found on page 9. Again, we will talk about in-text citations in depth in a future lecture, but just know now that it's very important that even when you're summarizing material and not just including direct quotations, you still do need to include an in-text citation. This is a big mistake that students tend to make. They think, oh, just because I'm not including a direct quotation, I'm just using my own words, I don't need to include a citation. That is wrong. That is plagiarism. So again, even though we're in a summary, we're using our own words, it's still not your ideas that you're using. So it's very important that we cite the original author when we are summarizing. So this is intended to be a group exercise in class, but because you guys are watching this at home or in the library, wherever you are, I would like you to do this as an individual exercise. So by yourself, I want you to create a summary of Brene Brown's Braving the Wilderness, Chapter 1. Hopefully by now you've read it, but I want you to pull out the main points. What are the themes, right? Like what message is being given here, right? And personal reflections that Brown articulates, right? So she gives a lot of anecdotes, a lot of little short stories, right, to kind of convey what it is she's talking about. So I want you to pull all of those things out of the text and write a brief summary, okay? Remember, use your own words to convey the author's ideas, but you can use direct quotations to support those ideas, okay? Again, I know we haven't talked about using direct quotations, but I still would like you to attempt to do this. So in your summary, anything that you find super important, maybe include a direct quotation straight from the text. Keep it concise, focus on the main points, and ensure that the summary is a true representation of the chapter's content without personal opinions, right? So take the next maybe 10, 15 minutes to do this and bring this to class. I will call on a few of you to read your summaries. So actually take the time to do this because you never know if I'm going to call on you, okay? So pause this video, take the next 10 to 15 minutes to summarize Chapter 1 of Braving the Wilderness. All right, moving away from summary and into narration. So what is narration? This is using a personal narrative to make an argument, okay? You are already familiar with writing personal narratives. You did one for Essay 0, so you already have a little bit of experience with writing a personal narrative, so that's great. this is examining an event or events in your life, connecting it to outside material, and using it as supporting evidence. So for this assignment, your very first essay, you are summarizing something from Brene Brown and then using your own personal experience to support what it is you're arguing, right? Connecting through personal narratives or narration is the most natural way for humans to communicate and relate. So in your essay, you are trying to convince somebody of something, or you're making an argument, right? You want your reader to relate to you when you're trying to persuade them to do or think something, right? If somebody relates to you, they're going to be more open to whatever it is you have to say. And by using personal narratives, that's like the most natural way that we as humans communicate and relate. So it's a really good persuasive tool, a really good device to use when trying to convince somebody of something or when you're making a claim, right? So narration is obviously written in first person. You are writing a story writing about an event or a series of events that actually happened to you, right? So first person, for those who don't know, that is I, me, we, our. When you're writing in first person, you are including yourself in the actual narrative. So this makes sense. In a personal narrative, you are writing about yourself, so it makes sense that this would be written in first person. Choosing a narrative. So how do we choose what story to tell in our paper? So first you want to choose a story or an experience or a series of events that connects to the outside material and is important to you, okay? So for this assignment, obviously, we're talking about Brene Brown, and you're making an argument about what factor is most important to finding that sense of true belonging, right? You're arguing that one is more important than another, right? You want to make sure that the story that you choose to tell is actually supporting that claim, because the whole point of this personal narrative is to use as evidence, right? You're using your own story to back up your claim, right? So you, of course, want to make sure that it connects to what you're saying in Brene Brown's text, okay? You also want to make sure it's important to you, right? It's easier for us to write about things that are important to us. As human beings, we are naturally narcissistic, and that's kind of just the truth, even at a subconscious level, right? We like to talk about ourselves, and so choose a story about yourself that's actually important to you. It'll just be easier and more enjoyable for you to write. Secondly, you need to know your story well. Again, that kind of goes back to it just being easier for you to write. If you know the story that you're telling really well, you'll be able to incorporate details that may be useful when trying to persuade or convince your reader of whatever it is you're arguing, okay? So whatever story you choose to write, make sure that you know it well. You can choose one story to tell or string together a series of stories, okay? So you can choose one event to tell, or you can string together like a series of events to tell that like together connect to back up your original claim. We are going to be reading a lot of personal narratives over the next couple of weeks, and many of them, if not all of them, do this, where instead of just telling one single story, they are connecting a bunch of little stories to back up whatever it is they're arguing. So keep that in mind. You can choose one single story, or you can string together a bunch of shorter stories. Be selective with what details you include. This is super important. I feel like the generation that we're in, I know that we are probably not in the same generation, but millennial, Gen Z, we have shorter attention spans than previous generations. We can thank social media for that, for sure. But that being said, it's hard to keep our attention sometimes. And so when we're writing, we have to keep that in mind. In order for your reader to be convinced or persuaded of whatever it is you're trying to convince them of or persuade them of, They have to be paying attention, right? And if we're including too many details, it's really easy for us to lose our reader's interest. And when that happens, there's no way that we're going to convince them of whatever it is we're trying to convince them of. So be selective with what details you include. That way you can keep your reader's attention. Beware the broad story. So this ties into this last point. You really want to be careful of making your story too broad. Like I said, it's easier for your reader to lose interest. For example, let's say you come into class and your friend says, "Hey, what did you do this weekend?" And you say, "Well, on Saturday, I woke up, I rolled over, I checked my phone, fell back to sleep, woke up, took the covers off, pulled my feet from out of the covers, put my feet on the floor, stood up, stretched." Like, you're including all of these little, like, teeny tiny unimportant details that, like, yes, all of that did happen. But when the question your friend asked you is, "What did you do this weekend?" Right? And so you don't want to give all of these super unimportant details. You want to give the details that matter, because let's say you do tell your story about this. By the time you get to stuff that's actually important and interesting to, like, what you actually did over the weekend, the person you're telling is no longer interested. They're kind of just like, "Oh my God, what is this person saying? Why are they taking so long?" Right? So it's very important for you to choose the details that you include in your story wisely. So this is kind of a visual representation of that. You have the very top pick, which is the timeline of events, right? Let's use the same example. This is a timeline of events that happened to you over the weekend, right? All those little black circles are all the things that happened to you. But when you are writing your personal narrative, you see all these arrows in the bottom picture that are showing you, like, what details you actually included. So all of the yellow dots are pieces of your weekend that you share in the story, that you include in the story that you're telling, because they're important, because they're relevant, because they're interesting, right? There are so many of those black dots that are now gray, which means we did not include them in our narrative because they weren't important to the main idea, like the overall picture of what I did this weekend. So kind of if you're a visual learner, hopefully this is helpful to you. It's very important for us to choose our details wisely with what we actually include in our narrative. We really want to keep our readers' attention, so really give them information that is interesting, that's important, that's relevant to what it is you're trying to say. Here are a few writing techniques for you to use when writing a personal narrative. So include descriptive imagery and sensory details, right? Include what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you feel in the story, right? You really want to immerse your reader in the story you're telling, right? When the reader is, like, really engaged and immersed in the story that you're telling, again, they're going to be more open to what it is you have to say. And again, you're arguing something. You're making a persuasive claim. And so you want your reader to be immersed in the story that you're telling. When we include imagery and sensory details, it also just kind of enhances realism and believability. Sometimes stories, when they're kind of vague or broad and they don't include these things, it's not that they're not believable or your reader doesn't think that it really happened. But when you include imagery and sensory details, it kind of just brings the story to life, right? When you're talking about, let's say part of your story takes place in your childhood home and your mom is baking bread, right? And you talk about what it smells like the smells wafting through the air in the kitchen and the heat that's coming out of the oven. Your reader might relate to that. They might think back to themselves like, "Oh my gosh, I remember what it smelled like when my mom used to bake bread as a kid," or, whatever it is. It'll make the story more real to them and more believable. And again, if they are feeling those things and they're more engaged with your story, they are more likely to be convinced of whatever it is you're trying to convince them of, okay? Imagery and sensory details also kind of just sets the mood of your overall paper. So if you are in your personal narrative, you are in a cemetery, you are burying a relative. that mood is probably like pretty sad and somber and serious, right? And so if you included descriptive imagery, like what it looked like and felt like around you in that cemetery, you can set that mood for your writer, right? Instead, if you're describing like rainbows and butterflies and things like that, that's going to give off a different mood, right? And if that's the mood that you want your reader to feel, great. But we want to make sure that we are including these details. That way our story has the feel, the vibe that we want it to. Balancing narrative and analysis. So storytelling is a means to an end. You don't want to forget that you are telling this story as evidence. You're using your story as evidence to back up your claim about Brené Brown's book, right? So your storytelling should convey that. You shouldn't just be writing a story to write a story. You want to connect this story back to your analysis of Brené Brown, right? You should highlight new insights that you learned from the events and directly connect to the outside material. This last bullet point, I cannot emphasize enough. It's very important for you to connect your story back to your analysis of Brené Brown, right? It should be very clear to me, like what the connection is between your story and your analysis of Brené Brown. So you want to make sure that you are going back to your analysis, right? You want to make sure that you directly connect with the outside material, with the source, okay? And in this case, again, it's Brené Brown. So it's very important that you make sure that you do make that connection.